New Orleans architecture is almost as varied as the cultures which call the city home. From the Spanish and French style blend in the French Quarter to the relative modernity of Gentilly, New Orleans architecture paints a picture of who lived within its limits even hundreds of years ago. Much of what could be called quote unquote old New Orleans, those which were settled before the 19th century, have a mix of French and Spanish architectural features. This is especially true of the French Quarter, which was rebuilt with Spanish architecture after the fire. It was originally French architecture. Elements of both cultures can be spotted throughout the city's older neighborhoods, which in essence becomes the message of both who lived here and when they lived. Spanish and French architecture, mostly due to the country's geographical proximity nestled on the Mediterranean Sea, share many similar features, especially during this time, which was around the Baroque era. Um, However, there are some distinctions uh, that can be viewed when you're walking through the streets of New Orleans. French architecture was all about high windows and ornate, small, little tiny details. Spanish architecture focused on metalwork and really heavy wooden features like doors. Uh, for example, St. Louis Cathedral is a good example of a unique blending of these two styles. Its tall, rounded windows are a little more indicative of French architecture, while the heavy wooden doors and ornate wrought iron fences are a little more indicative of Spanish. The architecture of this region tells the story of colonial Spanish and French Louisiana with a blend of old and new French and Spanish. The message in the oldest neighborhood in New Orleans and the oldest neighborhoods is that the history of New Orleans has spanned across not only centuries and generations, but entire empires as well. Coming in right after the quote unquote old New Orleans neighborhoods in New Orleans which were founded in the early 1800s take the combination of cultures to another level. In these neighborhoods, such as Esplanade and Marne Bywater, there are generally more unique to Louisiana and unique to New Orleans in particular styles. The classic shotgun and Creole style homes mix with commercial buildings in these areas. The styles tend to blend the ornate styles of both France and Spain into a new, distinct New Orleans architectural style. Shotgun houses, for example, send the message of a rapidly growing urban center that is now its own unique place. Their styles blend the tall features of French architecture, like windows and doors, with the ornate metalwork of the Spanish, while also allowing for more houses in the city with their long, narrow frames. Uh, Story goes is that it's a shotgun house because when you stood at the front door and fired a shotgun, the round would go right out the back door without hitting any walls in between. Now, when you get to the neighborhoods that came about in the mid to late 1800s, their architectural styles become a lot more varied. For example, the opulence of the Garden District is distinct from its neighbors, like the relatively industrial Warehouse District. The message in these areas changes from the small port city of colonial America to a sprawling metropolis in the making with its own unique and varied districts. The newest neighborhoods of New Orleans, like Gentilly and Lakeview in the north, tell the classic tale of suburban and semi urban America, generalized America. Most of these neighborhoods are characterized by more modern style homes of a slightly diverse nature. In some areas, there are the classic shotgun houses, and until recently, there were still other classic New Orleans features like the streetcars. Other areas, and especially as modern times come in, uh, they're a little less unique. If you didn't know you were in New Orleans, you'd probably be hard pressed to determine exactly where these homes are. Some of them are classic mid century modern, others are reminiscent of California bungalows, craftsman style. Much of these areas were populated by the middle class or upper middle class who desired the access that New Orleans provided without the busyness of the urban center. One particularly infamous neighborhood in this category is the Ninth Ward. Now, this was a poorer neighborhood of New Orleans, but had similar characteristics to neighborhoods like Gentilly and other outer edge New Orleans areas. Nowadays, the Ninth Ward as a medium tells the story of heartbreak and tragedy, but also rebuilding. Before Katrina, the Ninth Ward was a vibrant and active neighborhood. Houses were often passed down through families, giving this working class neighborhood one of the highest homeownership rates in the city, even compared to other wealthier areas. They were a combination of older homes, such as in the shotgun style, but unfortunately, Katrina wiped virtually all of the Ninth Ward's architecture and much more away. Nearly every building was either swept away by the storm or condemned by the city. Very few older buildings remain, and many are in disrepair. There have been revitalization efforts which have come about since Katrina, including a campaign which was sponsored by Brad Pitt called Make It Right, dedicated to helping lessen the devastation that Katrina wrought. Modern buildings with more industrial or general urban styles are starting to replace the ruins of the neighborhood. These buildings are generally characterized by modern features, so clean lines and either a color palette of bold and bright or simple and neutral. While the story told by the ruins of the ward may eventually be erased, hopefully a new chapter of growth and survival can replace that message of tragedy and heartbreak. So, the medium of architecture quite literally becomes a message about New Orleans and its story. From some of its first colonial inhabitants to its modern day residents, the buildings of New Orleans tell the story of culture, history, growth, devastation, and survival. The message is very clear. New Orleans has been here for hundreds of years and is certainly not willing to go away anytime soon.